My name is Shaun McCarthy. I've been involved with human synergistics since 1978, so a small amount of knowledge and understanding around the stuff. And I have a number of goals to achieve this morning. So for those of you that believe in this ridiculous notion of being always connected and are desperate to do your emails and answer your telephone messages, the morning will go something like this. I'll talk for the next half an hour. We'll have some questions and answers. We'll break into the group and have a table discussion with a report back. And we will break at 10:45 for 30 minutes. And then we're due to be finished by 1 o'clock this afternoon. So that hopefully will help you think about how you structure the morning for you. I need you to concentrate. So I'm going to ask you to do a small breathing exercise with me if you would. And so I'm going to ask you to breathe in for 4, slowly. Let's do it. 1, 2, 3, 4. Out. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Didn't make it to 8? We'll keep going until you do. Let's just do it one more time. In. 1, 2, 3, 4. Out. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This is an exercise in slowing your brain down and helping you to forget all those 120 emails that have probably already arrived in your inbox while you've been sitting here and all the stuff you need to do. Let's just do it one more time. In. 1, 2, 3, 4. Out. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Right? Also, if you have trouble sleeping, it's a good idea to lie in bed and do that a couple of times at night time because it slows your brain down. It literally does. So this morning is around organisational culture, as has been said, and all the elements associated with that. So my goals this morning are as follows. There are various models that we introduced to you as part of the feedback around the survey data that on the face of it can look really quite complex, but underlying them is absolute simplicity, and that is our goal. So my goals are to as follows here, to help you understand what we call the How Culture Works model. It doesn't mean to say you don't already understand it. If you do, that's great. Maybe add a little bit to that. So the How Culture Works model is a way of linking the components together in terms of ideal culture, actual culture, causal factors, outcomes, as we call them over time, the various components of the survey. And then having painted that sort of big picture, just to step back into the culture stuff. Because every organisation has a culture of some description. You can't not have one. And as one of the great writers on organisational culture, Edgar Shaun of MIT in the US wrote, every organisation has a culture. If you don't manage that culture, then that culture will manage you. Right? And culture becomes particularly relevant in times of change. In times when you have reduced funding, you have amalgamations in Australia, you have increasing expectations from your customer base around receptiveness to change, to quick responses and so-called customer service, and all of these things. Very few organisations manage to exist without requires for adaptation. And the single biggest determinant of an organisation's ability to adapt is organisation culture. So at the moment, everybody's talking about it. Why? Because the other major theme out there in the business world is disruption. And so if disruption is about being able to adapt to that disruption and culture is about ability to adapt, then that's one of the reasons why it's in the media an awful lot at the moment. Culture also has unintended consequences, as you've seen in the media around the banks. So where the banks have adopted cultures of aggressive sales techniques in order to obtain what they call share of wallet, it's worked extremely well for them, but nothing works forever. And so the unintended consequences, you've read about the so-called toxic cultures, etc. in the banks, not necessarily technically toxic, but nonetheless less than wonderful. The next is to look at your own data, and you have some handouts on the table which I'd ask you to completely ignore at the moment until we get to the points to discuss those, please. And then last and not least, in terms of where to from here. So we'll allow plenty of time for questions. I should warn you now that I'm as deaf as a doorpost, I have hearing aids that are very, very powerful, but they still don't get complete hearing. So when you say something, don't be surprised if I say, can you say that again? Which is why they don't roll me out for run workshops anymore. I get to do this sort of thing where there are minimal interactions with people. So the How Culture Works model is essentially around building a model for a high-performing organisation. Don't even worry about what sort of organisation, whether it's a city council, whether it's a university, whether it's a fast-moving consumer goods, is largely irrelevant. These are across-the-board applications of approximately 55 years of research into organisations and the management of those organisations. So we start with a very broad model. When you look into the literature on high-performing organisations, so in Australia we have some excellent examples in organisations locally here like Yarra Valley Water, which has been awarded the most innovative organisation in Australia award by the AFR about 2, maybe 3 years ago, which is quite an achievement for an organisation that is basically a water supplier, but they are an unbelievably innovative kind of organisation. So first step is something to do with purpose. So reading from left to right, there's the organisation's values. So when we look at organisations that are deemed to be doing very well at what they do, whatever that happens to be, there seems to be a sense of purpose in there somewhere. There seems to be a clearly identified set of what do we stand for kind of stuff. Moving again from left to right, there seems to be an employee experience where people consider that the values are real as opposed to nonsense throughout the organisation. That the organisation allows. So if one of the values is integrity, then it allows for that integrity. If one of the values is loyalty, then it allows for that loyalty. And some of these values things, I have to say, are extremely complex. So one of the illustrations is in the Australian Army right now. You may have read in the media around the investigation into certain campaigns in Afghanistan for both New Zealand, which I am a New Zealander, as you might have picked up, and Australia in terms of Special Forces activities. And one of the fundamental criteria in a military operation is loyalty. Problem is the media is pointing out loyalty to what? Loyalty to the organisation, loyalty to unit, loyalty to commander, and they may not necessarily be the same thing. So these are complex, they're not simple things. So the second element of a high-performing organisation seems to be that what goes on inside the organisation represents those values, is consistent with those values, and allows people to see and believe that they can achieve their full potential, whatever that might be. It has a culture that therefore reinforces those actions and creates beliefs around how people should behave that again are designed to achieve a sense of realisation and potential in the human condition. And last but not least, the attitudes about the organisation, so-called engagement, a good place to work, like working here, feel motivated, would recommend it to a friend to work, and all these kinds of things. So I'm going to use that as the basis for building this thing that you may see amongst the report back data called the How Culture Works model. So the first step is we're going to remove that far right one, which is the outcomes at the market level, whatever they may be, because we're going to take an internal focus only. So we're looking at the values, the employee experience, the culture, and the employee attitudes. The second step is to develop a direction of causation. So this is where the statisticians come in. We have a group in Chicago called the Human Synergistics Centre for Applied Research, a bunch of PhDs that I get to talk to all the time. And they are looking at causational, not just correlational research. So if you don't understand the difference between those two, it really doesn't matter. So we see the causation goes from left to right. So we're dropping out the values at this point. The direction of causation is the final three. So if employees experience certain things, it causes them to believe about behaviours and certain ways of behaviours that fit in this organisation, and they have certain attitudes towards the organisation. So it's really not much more complicated than that. So we use this circumplex, which I'll explain shortly, to describe the ideal, the values, the ideal culture. The employee experience we break up into these categories of mission and philosophy, Structures, systems, technologies and skills qualities. I'll talk about that a lot after morning tea. That's where we need to get down to the detail, because these are the causal factors. So if these cause culture, you want to change culture, then you probably want to do something about the causal factors. We use the circumplex again to measure the actual culture, and the outcome stuff is around individual, group and organisational level outcomes. So as an individual, do I feel motivated, satisfied? Do I experience different messages from people? Do I have role clarity? These kinds of things. At the team level, we work well in teams, we're cross teams. And at the organisational level, I see the organisation as being adaptive to change, producing high quality outputs, etc. And that is the How Culture Works model. It really is no more complicated than that. So we've got data at each of these, each of these elements here that we'll encounter as the day goes by. In terms of the tools that we used, there were the Organisational Culture Inventory, otherwise known as the OCI, Organisation Effectiveness Inventory, otherwise known as the OEI, and you completed both of them, you poor sods. You really enjoyed doing those surveys, didn't you? It is the survey from hell. It really is. I mean, the OCI has 132 questions and the OEI has 164, and hopefully you weren't counting them as you went. So thank you very much for your input and your staff's input, and I mean that quite sincerely, because it is a complex field that we work in. There's a great famous line by H.L. Mencken, an American poet, philosopher, writer, that says there is a simple solution to every problem that is wrong. Organisations are by definition complex. And so the more we try to simplify stuff, the more we actually miss the essence of where we need to focus our efforts. And it's all too easy to focus our efforts really where they don't count very much. So if you're going to spend all the money on this stuff and put all the time and all the effort into this, you want to be focusing on something that you know that if you change that, it will have this impact downstream, etc. Okay. So the two tools that we use, essentially the OEI actual and the OCI, and the OEI has the causal factors and the outcomes. And a long time ago, I found on file a long time ago, Moreland did an ideal survey of a number of people in the organisation to say what sort of behaviours should be encouraged and expected around here. So your data really looks no more complicated than this. Using the circumplex to describe an ideal culture, like every other organisation in the world, you seek what we call a constructive culture. Never yet. The OCI was developed in the late 70s in its original form. I've worked with it since about 1982 in its various forms over the years, and we've never seen an ideal culture in any country in the world that isn't predominantly blue, to make it simple. Passive defensive and aggressive defensive cultures simply don't work. And so the object of the exercise is to look at what's not working, focus our efforts on those green and red, if you like, bits and pieces, to push it up into the blue. So that's the starting point. In terms of the employee experience, an above and below the line exercise, don't worry about the detail in that graph, you can't see it, I don't expect you to see it. There's a benchmark, which is basically the average, and you're either above it or below it. And that's the furthest to the least above it and furthest below it to the least below it. And so you can see it's 50-50. So some things are over the line, some things have got a long way to come to get over that line. The net effect of which is you have a culture that looks like this. So this is helping this stuff happen here, but this is supporting this stuff here and stopping this stuff from happening here. And then there are the various outcomes. Again, using an average as a benchmark, you've got certain above and certain below. And so we're going to look at that in quite some detail as we progress through the second table discussion after the morning tea break. By way of illustration, again, I want to emphasise that whilst these models are terribly academic and all the rest of it, they're actually very practical and very straightforward. So here's an illustration. And I see this time and time again as a consultant out there. So the organisation will say, we want people to be innovative. So we might do lots of design thinking training, we might do all sorts of stuff where we want people to be creative and innovative, etc. So if we look through the system, the model, the organisation, let's just pretend, has a clear understanding of what the organisation is striving to achieve. So people understand. So when I say to you, what's Moreland here for, you can say it. You don't need to think. And when I say to the executive group, what are your core values, they say, oh, we've got 5 of them, and they get to 3 and they can't remember the last 2, kind of thing. So that's typical. 92% of organisations, if you want to figure around it. Right? Structure allows people to influence. The systems emphasise that ideas are more important than rules. The job design is high in autonomy, and leadership allows lots of involvement. So that then creates a culture that is constructive with the belief that personal effort can make a difference. And the message from the culture is give it your best shot, and all of what goes with that line. And the outcome is people are saying, well, you know, this is exciting, we can do this, we can innovate, we can have ideas, we can try different things. The flip side of that coin is where it doesn't work. So this is what we typically see. So they're saying we want people to be innovative, exactly the same intention, but there's little shared meaning in what the organisation is striving to achieve. Structure allows little influence. The systems emphasise procedures rather than ideas. The job design allows for little autonomy, and leadership allows for little involvement. So it's pretty much the exact opposite of what we had before. The net effect is a passive culture with little belief that personal effort can make a difference, and the message you take away from culture is just do your job. Keep your head down, keep yourself out of trouble, and just do it, kind of stuff. The net effect is it's not quite so exciting. Right? That's all. It's simply how it works. So the question is this stuff consistent with this stuff? If it is, it will cause a constructive culture, which will then be observed in outcomes at the individual group and organisational level. So a little bit of background to culture. I'm going to show you 2 videos. The first is very grainy, black and white, very old, poor quality, but I'm sure you'll like the content. It's from the 1960s show Candid Camera. You're not old enough to remember that, surely. Right, so this is the definition of organisational culture. So I'm just going to focus on one component of that how culture works model. So the shared beliefs, norms and expectations that govern the way people approach their work and interact with each other. So very important components in there, the words in blue. Beliefs, norms and expectations that govern the way people approach their work and interact with each other. I want to emphasise that word govern, very important word. I'll tell you a story, 1973. I'm wondering whether I should get the camera turned off for this or not. It's about my dear departed mother and my dear departed father. Right? Every family has a culture, so your family has a culture of some sort, and that culture can be described using our circumplex. Not that you would survey the family, right, but you can. So if I just tell you a story about how culture works and this importance of this govern thing. So in 1973, I was 21 years of age. I had a master's in clinical psychology, so I was quite bright, supposedly, right? You would describe on the circumplex, for those that understand it, our family culture as somewhat approval-oriented. Approval style is be nice, don't upset anybody, avoid conflict, keep relationships relatively superficial. So I went to boarding school and I'd go home for 2 weeks holiday and I'd be on my best behaviour and my parents would be on their best behaviour with me, bless their heart, and there would be very little conflict. Right? Just to give you some background to that, my mother had 2 master's degrees, which is very unusual in that generation to have a degree at all, let alone 2 masters. My father left school at 9 years of age because he was on an Irish crop farm. They had a severe frost, all the crop got killed. He and his father had to go and work in the meatworks to get money, and he never got around to going back to school. So on Saturday morning when we'd have the family line, my mother would be sitting there reading a magazine called Paris Match, which is a French magazine in French, and my father would be reading a Donald Duck comic. But he wasn't stupid, he was very bright, just not educated, and he found it too hard to read a book, so he'd read comics, right? So that's a little bit of the background. My mother was what you might call sensitive. Thus the family mantra, and this is one way of thinking about culture, the family mantra was don't upset mum. So part of the learned behaviour growing up as children was don't upset mum, because when you do it's just not worth it. Right? So, 1973 I met my still wife Lorraine, who came from what we would call an oppositional culture. An oppositional culture to oppose. So the first time I went there for the sort of proverbial Sunday roast lunch kind of thing, and all the uncles and the aunts were there, I was absolutely staggered, because part of the behaviour pattern in this family was to sort of use personal zingers. You know, like, oh, Uncle Fred, you put a bit of weight on over the last couple of weeks, chuckle, 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 right? And everybody laughs, but you know Uncle Fred's going, I'm going to get you next week, you prick. Right? So it's somewhat superficial, but the different style. The style now is to get brownie points, to get the room to laugh by saying something very critical of somebody else in the room, right? So you can see this is called a culture clash. This is usually a story I talk with executive groups when we're looking at mergers and amalgamations. Same principle. So the scenario is we're sitting in the back of my parents' car, my father is driving, my mother's sitting alongside him, and Lorraine and I are in the back seat. My mother was the 1973 version of the modern GPS system. So she's telling my father what to do at every step of the way, and I don't notice this because this is what we do. This is part of our culture. But geez, Lorraine notices it. And so she says, because she's come from this kind of culture, she says, oh, Pat, I'm sure Harry's perfectly capable of driving on his own. And I go, oh. Right? Because this is how culture works. It's a true story. Right? It took 12 years before my wife and my mother really talked to each other. My mother's now crying, which was predictable. And I knew exactly what would happen, and that is this is how dysfunctional cultures work. It's called triangulation in psychology. My father turned to me and said, Shaun, would you please ask Lorraine to apologise to your mother? So here's the $1 million question. What do I do? The point of the story is I did not have a choice. It governs the way people interact with each other and approach the task. So I had to say, Lorraine, look, clearly Mum's upset, would you just say sorry? And then figure out how the hell to explain it to her afterwards, right? But it's that pressured, that's an illustration of how culture works, that I have learned through experiences, the so-called causal factors, on what sort of behaviour is expected and the outcomes associated with that expectation, okay? So how the system motivates people to do things. What gets reinforced, rewarded, and punished, they become behavioural norms. Key elements to those are beliefs, norms, and expectations. So every organisation, every social unit, whether it's your family, a group of friends, or Moreland City Council, have certain beliefs. So I put one out there in front of you. A very common belief in local government is, and therefore a mantra of local government culture is, do not be on tomorrow's front page. Sound familiar? Right. And the media does not reward you for doing things well, but they sure as hell will put the whole front page when you screw up on one little thing. Because everybody loves to hate local government, or government per se. Right? So that belief creates certain behavioural norms. And those behavioural norms are around risk aversion and avoidance of risk and minimisation of risk, because we don't want to be on tomorrow's front page, which therefore creates expectations on people and managers that perhaps you have to check everything that your employee does because if it's wrong, etc., etc., etc. So see the links in a real world of local government.
The gentleman in the elevator now is a candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with the white shirt, the lady with the trench coat, and subsequently one other member of our staff will face the rear. And you'll see how this man in the trench coat tries to maintain his individuality, but little by little he looks at his watch once again, here's the candid subject. Here comes the candid camera staff, 3 of them at least. And this man has apparently been
very good illustration of culture. Expectations, norms, what's everybody else doing? So the new employee that starts the day with Moreland is that person with the hat, if you like. So he or she is going to be looking around at what people do, particularly what you folks do, because you're the bosses, right? And model their behaviour on that. I'll show you the next one. And not for naught, it was originally a research study done on group pressure.
To answer that question, we set up a hidden camera experiment to see if this woman would stand up at the sound of this tone, simply because everyone else is. You might be thinking you'd never go along with this. Or would you? After just 3 beats, and without knowing why she's doing it, this woman is now conforming perfectly to the group. But what happens if we take the group away?
Elaine, please.
Okay, now she's alone. The crowd is gone, and nobody is watching her, except our hidden cameras. What do you think she'll do? She's now conforming to the rules of the group without them even being there. Now, watch what happens when we introduce another outsider who doesn't know the rules.
Have a seat and I'll be out in just a couple minutes. Thanks so much.
Think she'll teach the new guy what to do? We kept the cameras rolling as more unsuspecting patients arrived. And slowly but surely, what began as a random rule for this woman has now become the social norm for everyone in this waiting room. Here to explain what's going on in their brains is Jonah Berger of the University of Pennsylvania.
This sort of internalized form of herd behavior is part of what we call social learning. Starting at a very early age, when we see members of our group perform a task, our brains literally reward us for following in their footsteps.
When I saw everybody stand up, I felt like I needed to join them. Otherwise, I'm like excluded. Once I decided to go with it, then I felt much more comfortable.
this nonsense. Eventually join the ranks. And the only thing more shocking than seeing how easily conformity affects the way you act is that similar forces are subconsciously shaping the way you think right now.
So where the first one was designed to be funny because it was a candid camera exercise, this was actually an experiment that Wisconsin and Stanford co-partnered on. And you see exactly what's happening. So I show that one because the key to that particular story is that she's standing up even when she's on her own, and she causes the new people to stand up. So therefore there will be ingrained in the causal factors, in the experiences of people in this organisation, stuff that happened a long time ago that people talk about as if it happened yesterday. And that will be affecting the culture. So I've had a very easy illustration would be talking to a company where people sort of say, you get really crucified around here if you make a mistake. And when we did a really in-depth focus group discussion with all the people in the management population, relatively small organisation, nobody really had been seriously punished for a mistake for a very, very long time. But it was part of the ethos that you get punished if you make a mistake around here. So it's that complex, that if Moreland City Council is X years old, whether it's 10 as a result of amalgamations or 120, then what happened very, very long time ago has implications for the culture. So the circumplex, so that's the how culture works model, sort of what culture is, and it's really quite practical, it's quite pragmatic. You'll see culture play out in this room, you'll see culture play out in your own family when you go home tonight if you get the chance to do that, and so on. So now we use a measurement tool to profile that culture. And this is where the circumplex comes in. So circumplex is a technical name for a profiling system that's most distinguishable by having similarities alongside each other and opposites opposite each other. So it's unusual to have a culture that is 1 in 7. You can have it, it's just unusual to have that. But it's very common to have a culture that's 1 in 2 or 9 in 10 or whatever it might be. And that's all. So if you start at 12, you've got something that's very similar to 12 until you've got the opposite of 12, and something that's very similar to 6 until you've got the opposite to 6. And it's structured around various components which I won't go into. But what I'm going to do is cover off a lot of data over 12 slides. And the slides are made up of a description of the style, with some information down the bottom on how you're going, and the retest comparison between last year. So this is last year's total Moreland, and this is the most recent total Moreland. So you can see these have come in, these have come in, this has come out slightly, these have remained pretty much the same. So the first cluster, if you like, is the so-called blue stuff, the constructive cluster. In constructive cluster, people believe that they should do their job well and work with those around them. There's high psychological safety. So psychological safety says if I act vulnerable in a certain situation, you won't make the most of that vulnerability. Or if I tell you a personal secret, for want of a word, I know that you won't share it around the place. So people feel safe psychologically in the place. And so thus their primary need is to obtain a sense of satisfaction from what they do. And one easy way to think about culture is the so-called reward-punishment ratio. So in a constructive culture, there tends to be high rewards, and I don't mean lots of money. It's usually praise, opportunities for advancement and promotion and that kind of stuff, but there's relatively low punishment. So the ratio here is high reward, low punishment. And keep in mind with rewards, I'm not referring to money. So as we go around the clock, 11 o'clock. So basically what we want is people to feel a genuine sense of accomplishment from what they do. I mean, a great day at work, amongst other things, is when you can drive home at the end of the day or catch the tram home and say, I got it, I did it. I struggled, I had to work hard at it, but I achieved it. Some sense of accomplishment. So therefore to have that, we need a culture that encourages people to strive, to set reasonably challenging goals. And not reasonable is the key word in there, reasonably challenging. Think ahead and plan and a whole bunch of other stuff. So the items are those, plus a number of others to identify that. And when we see what's happening with your data, there's been no change in this. And so you need to take some action around that one. So that's one of the first focuses, is improving the achievement style culture in the organisation. Because what that will do by playing around with this kind of stuff is increase the odds that people will go home saying, I had a good day at work because I achieved something. Now you can have a good day at work because of other reasons, they are yet to come. That's one of them. 12 o'clock. So what we want here with self-actualising is we want people to enjoy themselves. So they can go home and say, I had a great day at work, I really enjoyed myself today. And I learnt something and I grew, or something like that. So you want a culture that encourages people to think creatively, have fun, be unique, and those are some of the items, plus a whole bunch of others to measure that. And for you folks, there's no change. And so again, this is an area for action for you. These are, by the way, the 10th, 25th, 50th, 75th, 90th and 99th percentile, for those that like the detail. The ring. So we take your score of 17 and we compare it to how other organisations score. And at this point, 10% score to there, so it's a very low score, 25% score to there, so it's quite a low score. The bold ring is 50%, so half score less, half score more. 75% score in that range, so once you're up there you're starting to be quite high. 90% in that range, so that's very high, and 99% through to here. You never have a 100th percentile for a bizarre reason. So we need to do some action around that one. 1 o'clock, humanist encouraging. We want people to feel supported by those around them. So again, this is another element of going home and saying, I had a great day at work today. Because you folks supported me. I put myself out there and you helped me. You didn't criticise me or whatever. So we want a culture that encourages people to do that kind of stuff. And you're actually trending up on that. Not a lot, but it's up. And that's great. So keep it up. Whatever it is you're doing that's causing that to trend up, keep doing it. Affiliative. We want people to feel that they get on well with each other, that they've got people that they can get close to, build relationships, work well with, build teams, etc. So we want a culture that encourages people to think of the group's needs, they're approachable to other people, etc. This one's not changing, so action required there again. So the 4 constructive styles, one of them's trending up and sitting above the average, the others could do with some effort. The passive defensive cluster. So passive defensive cultures, basically people feel they need to keep themselves out of trouble, lay low when things get wrong, avoid blame and all that kind of stuff. So passive defences occurs now where there's low reward and high punishment. So if I do a great job, nobody notices, but if I make one mistake, oh my God. Right? And so again, not money. So 3, trending down, well done, keep it up. So as you can see, it's gone, it was relatively low, it's even lower still. So we don't want people to feel that they have to be nice to each other and make sure you keep on the boss's good side, because now they're no longer thinking about what they're trying to achieve, they're now thinking about keeping themselves safe. So they're not focusing on the end goal anymore. So we don't want a culture that encourages people to just simply please others, agree with everyone and stay on people's good side. So that's good, well done. Conventional, trending down again. You see where it's come from. It was relatively in the medium-high range here. It's now down below the 50th percentile in the low-medium range. So we don't want people to feel they need to treat rules as more important than ideas. Don't go absolute. We're not saying don't have rules. We're saying we don't want the rule. So one of the items is follow the rules even if you think it's wrong. Right? Classic of this kind of culture. And so we don't want to encourage people to simply maintain the status quo, not rock the boat, fit into the mould, etc. Dependent. We don't just do what they're told, check with their boss. So therefore we want a culture that encourages people we don't want, even when they're wrong. Again, trending down, big tick, keep it up. So you can see here there's a big reduction from that's actually marginally over the average, you can't see it in that graph, to well below the average. And the avoidance is we don't want people to feel that they need to work in fear of being blamed for real or imagined problems. So we don't want a culture that encourages people to lay low, etc. So again, you're doing very well on that. You can see it was one of the highest in the profile. It's now down to just a notch below the 50th percentile. The aggressive defensive culture is where people believe they need to push themselves forward in order to be seen. So it's sort of like the opposite of the passive defensive stuff, if you like. And they need to outdo others, and there's low psychological security. But in this case, it's high reward and high punishment. So a very easy illustration to hook onto would be my son. My son is a trader in a global investment bank. So he gets paid millions of dollars, screw up once and he's fired. So it's very high reward, but every day he goes to work wondering whether something's going to go wrong and he's going to get fired. Right? So that's classic of that aggressive defensive culture. So what we don't want is this oppositional stuff where people feel they're always going to be criticised no matter what they do. And so we don't want a culture that encourages people to find fault, critical, oppose, and that's trending down again. It's gone from the average to the below the average. So extraordinarily well done effort there. Power. We don't want people to feel they've got to be tough and forceful and all that kind of stuff. So we don't need a culture that encourages people to play politics, be demanding of others, stay on the offensive, etc. Again, it's coming down. It was quite low anyway. It's almost non-existent now. Competitive. We don't want people to feel they have to compete against each other. So what we don't need is a culture that encourages people to turn the job into a contest, to get into intellectual debates and all that kind of stuff and feel they've got to outperform each other. Again, it was very low, it's even lower. And last and not least, perfectionistic, which again was relatively low and even lower still. So we don't want people to feel they have to do everything absolutely perfectly. And those are the key words, everything absolutely perfectly. Right? And get caught up in lots of irrelevant detail. So what we don't need is one that encourages people to don't ever make a mistake kind of stuff and be precise even when it's not necessary. So when we look at that, in terms of, I'll just ignore this one for one moment, in terms of overall change, you see some has been achieved, more work to do if you like. Have to admit the reality of subcultures in organisation. I want you to primarily think about the overall culture this morning, but we all operate within, as you can see here, slightly different cultures in various parts of the organisations. Also, you'll find different cultures at different levels of the organisation. This is quite typical. So if you take one of the very easy ones to explain autonomy. So autonomy is a job design fact that it has a huge amount of influence on culture. So you would say autonomy, if you're not familiar with the word, I'm sure you are, means I get to make some decisions about how I do my job. So if I'm chief executive, that might be capital investment. If I'm a cleaner, it might be, do I clean this floor first or that floor first? So I get to make decisions about my job. And of course you'd expect CEOs and members of management groups to have high autonomy, but it gets a little lower as you go down the organisation. So the impact is on the culture, and that's just one of the 31 causal factors that we're looking at. So you can see at the top end of the organisation, and this does represent a significant shift from previous data, the challenge at the moment is to get it down through the organisation, and that is a challenge. Because particularly when you have dispersed work groups, you've got parks and recs people, you've got libraries and swimming pools, and they're all over the place. And people might be managing parks groups that have multiple locations. Therein lies the challenge. They're not all in a beautiful building like this. So just to answer that question, because it's usually asked, does it matter? Are we going to take questions in 1 minute? These are the outcomes. And this is that gap bar chart, as we call it, where the average becomes 0, and how much above and below the average do you sit. You can't see that one because it's right on the average. Right? So reading from left to right, people are saying, well, I'm not very stressed by the job. We do reasonably well teamwork stuff. I would like to stay here. Role clarity's not bad. Role conflict's okay. That means I don't get inconsistent messages. Inter-unit coordination just made it, but I'm not very satisfied. I don't think the organisation adapts particularly well to changes in an external environment. I feel somewhat insecure in my job. I'm not overly motivated. I think that my department could do a lot better than it's currently doing, and I think the organisation could do a lot better than it's currently doing. And that's actually quite a good result compared to many that we see. So don't be disheartened by that. I mean, we regularly see that they're all under the line with organisations. So to have half and half is not a bad effort. So coming back to this, your first table discussion, so just to guide any questions you might want to ask, is around what have we done to create that change. In a nutshell, the change could be represented as, put it in technical terms, we have reduced the passive defensive and the aggressive defensive styles, but we have not as yet increased the constructive styles. And you can see that. So what does that mean in everyday terms? We've removed a number of the behavioural expectations that are restrictive. It's like we've taken the handcuffs off. We're de-emphasising the rules and the procedures and attempting to emphasise ideas and that kind of thing more, but we haven't yet got to the point where we're creating positive expectations of things. Does that make sense? So we've removed a lot of the make sure you keep your boss happy, just do what you're told, for God's sake don't get caught doing something wrong, if you can't get out of doing something then be against it, and all this kind of stuff. We've got rid of that, but we haven't got the make some decisions, get involved, have an influence, have autonomy in your job, etc., etc. So what I want you to focus on for the first table discussion, because although that might be disheartening to look at, it's actually a very significant step, because you cannot have a constructive and a defensive culture. You'll always have bits of everything, right? We're not after a perfectly, totally constructive culture. That's perfectionism, right? But what we are after is a culture that has got a lot more blue than green and red, and you're starting to look like that already. Don't focus on being more innovative, you focus on doing these things that create more innovation. See? And to some extent, these are the causal factors. So for instance, research on innovation shows that you cannot be innovative without high levels of autonomy. So unless I have the ability to influence how my job gets done, it's just, this is one of many, not on its own, so don't see anything in isolation. But if I don't have the ability to make decisions or the permission to make decisions about whether I sweep this floor or that floor or whatever it might be, again, don't think of autonomy as the sweeper can now make CapEx decisions, all right? That's the CEO's job or whoever's, right? But it's decision. I mean, I'll give you an illustration about autonomy at the risk of telling you a story about a hospital. This is, and the importance of job design. So this would be probably 15 years ago now. I was involved with one of our Chicago-based senior colleagues on doing a culture survey of the Chicago Pediatrics Hospital, which is actually 7 hospitals, and they're all very, very big, as you can imagine with a city the size of Chicago. And there's certain sort of logical assumptions you could make. So you would expect perhaps certain departments to have a reasonably constructive culture and certain departments to probably not. And one of the assumptions that you would make in a hospital is that the cleaners probably don't have a particularly constructive culture, because you know they do a certain kind of job, particularly in pediatrics, right? But to our surprise, the most constructive culture was cleaners, right? And I'll never forget talking to the supervisor of that particular department, and sort of basically trying to find out, you know, how and why. And he said, look, when you did the survey, I had started here about 12 months before that, and just before starting here, I was very fortunate to go on to a course on job design. And every job is made up of 5 components. Here's the test as I can remember them: autonomy, variety, identity, significance, and feedback. So every job is made up of those 5 things, either a little bit or a lot of each of the 5. And they are measured, by the way, as causal factors. And he said, one of the things I realised in hospitals for cleaners is that everybody is identified with the patient except for the cleaner. The cleaner identifies with space. So he said, I tried an experiment. He said, when a kid gets admitted, they get admitted to a department, to a surgeon, to a nurse, etc., whatever, they also get allocated to a cleaner. And he said that, I thought, should increase the sense of purpose for the cleaners, because they're not just cleaning Ward 6, they're now looking after these 50 kids, 100 kids, or whatever it might be. He said the problem with that, of course, is kids move. They come into medical, they get shifted to surgical, they come back to medical, etc. So he said, we did it anyway, and he said, you might have noticed as you walk around the hospitals, there's absolute bloody chaos, his words. He said, there's trolleys all over the place. He said, but here's the really interesting thing. Just a couple of months ago, the city did a review of productivity of hospitals. And he said, what you would think would be the least efficient form of cleaning, we actually had the highest productivity rate of any hospital system in the city. Across those 7. So he said, you see the chaos out there, but he said, funnily enough, it works. And it works because of the job design downstream stuff. So, autonomy. The second thing, that innovation will not happen unless you have good, call it teamwork. Again, we measure this as an outcome. We call it intra-unit teamwork and cooperation. And so unless we are working well, not just being a team, but working well as a team, you're not going to get innovation. The third key component for innovation is the left hand knows what the right hand is doing. That's called cross-team coordination, or inter-unit coordination, we measure it as. And so when we do this, we know what the implications for this other group. So you've got tremendous coordination across the groups. The other thing that we know that's required for innovation to occur is distributed influence, as it's called. And so there is a high degree, it's gone, I was going to bring something up on my laptop, but it's turned itself off. There's a high degree of distributed influence. So right down at the bottom of the organisation, people can give ideas around how things could be done. And last and not least comes back to, which is why I did that reward-punishment ratio. There's a high reward, low punishment. So if you get a great idea, you're a bit of a star for a while, and you're made to feel really good about it, or it increases your opportunity, potential for promotion, or going off on training courses, or whatever it might be. The ways we reward people without simply throwing money at them, which is what aggressive defensive cultures do. So yes, my son does earn an awful lot of money, but he could be fired today. And all you've got to do is lose a few $1 million on a trade, or in this case, a couple of $100 million on a trade, and that's it, he's gone. Right? So don't think of money when we say reward. In fact, we know, strangely enough, that the most aggressive cultures in Australia are the highest payers in their industry, and I don't say this in public. The most constructive cultures, organisations are often the lowest paid, and that sort of said, oh, if we underpay everybody, we're going to get a constructive. No. It doesn't work that way. But they don't rely on throwing money at people to motivate them, right? So this idea of distributed influence, inter-unit coordination, teamwork, autonomy, and various other elements of job design, and of course a strong sense of purpose comes in as important to that. So the sort of things that you've talked about, just listening and trying to synthesise your comments, because obviously I'm not familiar with your organisation, that's the job of our consultants who are working with the OD team, is around collaboration. And so one of the things that has clearly shifted in the survey data over the last 12 months is what's called distribution of influence. So distribution of influence is the organisation an autocracy? So she gets to make all these decisions and you just do what you're told? Is it a democracy? Right? Or is it a revolution or chaos, which you don't want? And an organisation by definition is not a democracy, otherwise she would get paid the same as the people in the Parks and Recs team. Right? It's not. She has higher responsibilities, etc. But you don't want it to be like that. You sort of want it to be something like about that. Right? So it's not a democracy, but it's not an autocracy. It's somewhere in between. And that's called distribution of influence. So that has increased significantly. The other thing a couple of groups talked about was sort of recognition, rewards, praise, these kinds of things. So again, one factor that has increased quite substantially over the last test period has been what we call use of rewards, which is I will get recognised, I will get praised. There is one question, is I might get a raise or a bonus or something like that, but it's only one of a number of questions. So if you rated that low because you're on award structures, didn't recognise a whole lot of other organisations are also on reward structures, so it sort of comes out in the wash. And there has been a small shift in autonomy in the organisation. So I think it was city infrastructure, is that? Yeah, mentioned increase in autonomy. So yes, that's happened, need for more. Right, we're due to break. We're 5 minutes early. Is that going to be a problem with any food setup, do you think? Yeah. So that was a little chaotic, but you got your head around it. I mean, at the risk of using up a minute while we wait, I'll tell you a very old-fashioned consultant's joke, right, about chaos. So 3 old retired guys are sitting in the pub having a drink. One's a builder, one's an architect, the other's a consultant. And the builder says, well, of course, we are the most important occupation because, like, we built the pyramids, we built the Acropolis. And the architect says, yeah, but you just built it. The architects designed it. The architects took chaos and turned it into order. And the retired consultant says, yeah, but who created the chaos? Right? So that was a little chaotic, and that was my idea, to just get the ideas flowing out. Because as we move forward, what I'm going to do is work through the total Moreland data of this graph here, because in there lies the answers to the questions of what do we need to do now. And I'm going to spend some time working away across, again, another graph that could be somewhat complicated to understand, but it's really very straightforward once you get your head around it. Reminds me to say, when we have the Q&A section, please feel free to ask questions. You will not be judged about the question. Firstly, at the gender differences. There are none. That was easy. So often we will find when we crunch the data, because the folks that run the survey say, can you tell us what males versus females say, we will see a difference. But every time, and I mean every time we investigate that, it has not to do with the gender, but the type of work the gender is doing. So if I give you a very simplistic illustration, some years ago we did a culture survey for a company called AMP, and for what it's worth, we warned them long term if they didn't do something about their culture, it would cause some problems for them. Every prediction I've ever made in 42 years of consulting has come true. Not my brilliance, it's just this stuff is predictable as the day is long. There's so much research around this material it isn't funny. So AMP found a dramatic difference between males and females. But when we looked at it, there was a higher probability that somebody in an office role, like claims management, would be female than male. And when we looked at the outdoor kind of jobs like brokers and salespeople, there was a higher probability that those people would be male rather than female. So it wasn't so much because when we looked at each of those areas, males and females described the culture the same way. So on the face of it, it looks like there might be, but further evidence suggests that there isn't. Which brings me to the other question around how many of you here have done a lifestyles inventory or an LSI at some stage where you get feedback about you? Right, most of you, thank you. Just a couple of points around the relationship between this and that. The circumplex remains the circumplex. It is a circular characterization of multiple simplexes into a circumplex, if somebody just happens to want the technical details. Most of you, that went straight past there as it was designed to. So the circumplex remains the same. Achievement is achievement, self-actualizing is a blah, 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 blah. It's what about that stuff that's being measured is the difference. So with an OCI, with a culture survey, it's to what extent do I believe I am expected to set goals, strive, set reasonably challenging goals, think ahead and plan, etc., etc. Whereas in an LSI, in the one, do I see myself as a person who sets goals, strives, etc. Right? And do you see me as a person who sets goals and strives, etc., etc.? So it's the same stuff, just a different aspect of it. And so an LSI does not make an OCI. You can't aggregate all your LSIs and say that's the culture, because it didn't measure culture, it measured behaviours. So again, for the OD people, if you do aggregate LSIs, you have a very good picture of what's called the interpersonal climate. Because if we take all of you, however many, 70 people in the room, and aggregate your LSI 2s, we have 70 times 10 people or whatever's views of how you behave, which is interpersonal climate. So if you say that I'm a very aggressive individual as a manager, then I will interact with other people in that kind of way, and if we all do that, then that becomes the interpersonal climate, if that makes sense. So please don't confuse your LSI with your OCI results, and I'm not being, what's the word I want to say, won't come snobbish or whatever in saying that. The other is, however, there is a clear logical relationship between the two types of feedback. If I am very constructive as a manager, it increases the probability that I am creating a constructive culture around me. So if this was my team and this is all the people that I managed, and I'm unbelievably constructive, and we ask you folks to do a culture survey, there's a high probability you would describe a reasonably constructive culture. Now, keeping in mind that of the 31 causal factors, only 6 of them are to do with leadership. So there's a whole bunch of other stuff that the organisation's doing to these people that I may not be able to control, which also influences the culture. Which is why I did not say if I am highly constructive, they will. I said there's an increased probability that they will. Equally, if I'm passive defensive, it increases the probability that my people will describe a defensive culture. Not necessarily passive defensive, they might describe aggressive defensive because they get very frustrated and angry with my passivity. So it's become the norm to walk out the door and talk about Shaun as being the biggest idiot in town kind of stuff, which is aggressive defensive behavioural norms. So we can't guarantee that green creates green, but what we can guarantee is green creates green and red, or red. And red creates green and red, or red, or green and red, okay? So one way of building a more constructive culture is to grow constructive people. Whether that is the CEO, right down to the bottom of the organisation. Don't necessarily need to do LSIs to help people become constructive. What it needs for you is to understand what constructive means and manage that. So one of the things, for instance, I talked about approval and reduction of conflict. One of the strange things about highly constructive cultures is they actually have a reasonable amount of conflict. It's called constructive differing. So I will disagree with you, but in disagreeing with you, together we'll strive to achieve some sense of agreement around what we want to do. And out of that disagreement comes different ideas. By the way, talking about gender differences, if you want something to take home for the females in the room, there is substantive research around group composition and problem-solving effectiveness and gender. And I hate to say it, it goes something like this. If you take 5 people, the worst decision makers are 5 men. The next worst decision makers are 4 men and 1 female. The next worst are 3 of each. The next worst are 1 and 4, and the best are 5 females. Interesting, isn't it? It would appear that groups of females make better decisions than groups of males in substantial test situations, using simulations for decision making and those kinds of things. Right? So yes, go girl, kind of thing that I just hear you say over there. But again, I would recommend balance. Right? I would recommend balance. Okay. Any other questions before we move on? What I have attempted to cover so far is the 2.5 of those 4 pieces. So we've given you part of Moreland's results, the culture stuff, and for those with sharp eyes, you'll decide that my perfectionistic prevailed and I swapped them around to be where they should be.
Just one question.
Go ahead.
Is there any data behind the volume of the reply? So you notice that some are very small volume and some are very large. Is there any
Very good question. 2 things there. One, it is, actually there's 1,000 things there. Try and limit yourself, Shaun, to what's relevant. It's easier to develop a constructive culture in a small group because you've only got 27 people to influence as opposed to 800 people to influence. It's harder to change culture in groups like city infrastructure, for instance, where you've got a whole lot of parks and recs and I don't know, again, I don't know your organisation, but you possibly have roads people or comms people or sewerage people or plumbing people or whatever. You've got a lot of blue collar type labour. Where the average leading hand, team leader of an outdoor type of group or a blue collar type of group, their management education extends to, what's your problem, get on and do the job and fuck off out of my office. Right? Do you remember I said that, won't you? And so one of the biggest issues in large organisations is frontline leadership development. The people who are at the coalface leading those people. Because they have all of the typical management responsibilities of work scheduling, and oh my God, Fred or Mary's called in sick today, what the hell am I going to do about this? And so they're very tasky caught up. And it's very easy to not be people oriented when you're buried in task. Right, so that's another answer to your question. So if you've got a large group, you're probably getting into blue collar or lots of office workers or whatever, and you'll have those issues around leadership at that end. I think that probably do. The other technical answer, because we undoubtedly have economists and social scientists and people like that in the room, is what's called a regression to the mean, scientifically. The more people you get, the more you end up with an average result. So our 50th percentile, so this, if I go back a slide, this ring here, the dark one, represents the 50th percentile. So 50% of organisations score over there and 50% score under there. So if we took all the organisations in Australia that we have data on, which is about 3,000 organisations, it will be a perfect circle, the 50th percentile. Because when you average everybody, what do you get? Average. So if we average 7 people, we're likely to get a more expansive kind of profile than averaging 600 people, simply because the statistical elements are regression to the mean. Okay? That's the third answer. So some more results and the future forward look in terms of what do we do. Now you might like to have this visible in front of you. You have on your table a chart that looks like this, causal factor summary bar chart, and I believe it's for your particular directorate. Is that right, Alex? No, that's all. Okay. Right. Okay. So you've got 2 charts on your desk. You've got this one here, and that's for the all org data. That's everybody. And you have this for your particular area, directorate, etc. So I would suggest, as I move through the presentation, that you have this one visible. Easy to see, that everybody can sort of glance as I talk, kind of thing. So just like with the circumplex, it took me 15 slides to basically run around the circumplex. I'm going to run through, I think it's about 10 slides to work across this. So the causal factors, so what's causing the current culture to look like it does? That's basically it. And so, again, I was talking to Alex at tea time, is you don't actually focus too much on changing culture, because culture is an outcome of the causal factors. So you focus on changing the causal factors, which will change the culture, which in turn will change the outcomes. That's the whole idea of one of those very early, when I was building the How Culture Works model for you, is the causation. Is that we know from substantial research and statistical application of regression analysis work, for those that like the detail, that there is a causational relationship between, if we have more effective job design, it will impact on certain constructive elements of the culture, particularly achievement, which will lead to people being more motivated and potentially more satisfied, but in particular more motivated. So a lot of organisations who measure engagement, for instance, and it's fine to do that, are focusing on the end of that equation, So engagement is, am I motivated? Do I like working here? Is it a good place to work? Would I recommend it to a mate to work here? And all that kind of stuff, advocacy, whatever. It's an outcome of culture. Culture is an outcome of causal factors. So the focus moving forward is the causal factors. In the presentations I note that Alex gave me that have been used or will be used in the organisation, the tendency is to use what we call the gap bar chart. And the gap bar chart takes the historic average, turns it into a 0, and says how many percentile points above and below the historic average is your organisation. In theory, and not necessarily in practice, you'd say, oh my God, look at that one, let's do something about that. But it's not that simple, because you might actually get more bang for your buck if you did something about that, for instance, whatever the hell that happens to be, and that's where I'll walk you through it. So you've got, of the 31, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 of the 31 above the line. And then the rest, some are just below, so that's not too bad. These ones here are obviously well below the line. So that's called the gap bar chart, and that's what's being used for you folks as part of your presentations. I'm going to use the alternate graph for the purpose that I want to achieve, which is the same stuff, but it's now clustered into groupings, and the colour coding represents those groupings. The yellow, the blue, the yellow, the greeny, grey colour, the blue, the red, brown, whatever. And in doing so, there is the 50th percentile. That is this mark here. So to show you how this one works, organisational bases of power is 10, 20, well, no, let's say 24 percentile points above the historic average. There is the historic average. There is organisational bases of power, which is 10, 20, 24 percentile points above the historic average. Make sense? So there's the same data presented in different ways. But it's the clustering of these that for what I want to focus on moving forward we will use. But you can relate it to either graph. It's just that when we do the gap bar chart, because it's in the bigness of gap, they're not in the same order anymore. So I'm going to work our way across. Your table discussion when I finish this will be, so what do we think we need to do? So this is sort of like, listen carefully because I will say this only once kind of thing. But if you want to take notes, feel free. So this is me going through your causal factors and offering some thoughts on what might be helpful. So the two aspects of mission and philosophy that we measure are articulation of mission. Is there a clearly articulated sense of purpose, mission about this organisation? And they're saying, oh yeah, just above the 50th percentile. So it's not a bad score, not a great score, but it's okay. But it could be more. The second aspect of that is we know best that these missions and philosophies and values or whatever we want to talk about work best when they are associated with a, let's just call it a customer. Right? So I am doing something for somebody. It might be an internal customer. It might be a social goal that you're striving to achieve in social development or something like that. And so therefore, who are we striving to do this for? Is it this particular population group or this particular demographic or whatever it might be? And that's where it's a little short. So 29% of organisations score lower than you do, but 71% score higher. So the first thing is, you could do a little bit more on the articulation of the mission, but importantly, frame it in ways that links individual efforts to outcomes for, there's no better word unfortunately than a customer. Now, that's easy if you've got a customer, but it might be an internal customer. As I say, it could be a policy group, it could be a social group, a demographic, whatever. We know that people achieve greater satisfaction and impacts the culture through the process of having a sense of doing something for somebody. So one of the suggestions for you in your particular department is like answer the question, who is your customer? And it's not an obvious answer in many cases, as you well know. I mean, to some it might be easy, customer services, it's the ratepayers, right, or whatever. But for policy development group or something like that, it's a little less. But who is it? Is it the council? Is it the CEO? Is it some other group inside the organisation? Or is it in fact the greater, something to do with the Greater Melbourne, whatever. So there's the first step, and that's the first two on that chart that I said, just keep it visible. The next is the structures section. And this measures 4 different, but often seen as the same things, but they're not. Total influence, distribution of influence, empowerment, and employee involvement. So total influence is, the easiest way to explain this is the way it was asked. How much influence does each of these levels of the organisation have? Top management, immediate supervisors, staff. Whatever, I can't remember what the exact word is, right? And so you score top level managers, my immediate supervisor manager, which is theoretically sort of middle management, team leader kind of stuff, and me down the bottom of the organisation. Then we literally just add that up and say, well, how much influence is there in total? And as you'll see, it's quite low. It's at the 26th or 7th percentile. Very common in councils, in local government, because so much of the influence rests with the council that it's not untypical for employees. Oh, that's the third level, employees. It's not unusual for employees to rate top management lower than you would in an insurance company or a bank or a beer company or whatever. But it does raise some serious question marks around the total influence in the organisation. Right? On the other hand, I talked earlier about distribution of influence. On the other hand, although there's a lack of influence, it's reasonably well distributed. Right? It's not an autocracy stool, it's not a democracy, it's somewhere in between the two. So that's pretty good. Empowerment is often superimposed over influence, etc., but it isn't. Empowerment means I have the tools and training necessary to do my job. So an easy way to think of it is think of the opposite, disempowerment. Shaun, I want that on my desk by 4 o'clock tomorrow. Look, I have no idea how the hell. I don't care, just get it on my desk by 4 o'clock tomorrow. I'm now disempowered, right? So it creates a passive and an aggressive culture. And so we're not doing that to people. We are giving them the training and materials, necessary equipment, necessary to do their job. So here you score above the 70th percentile. So that's way up there, that's fantastic. Employee involvement is I get involved in making suggestions for improvement. When I give ideas to my manager, he or she will listen to me. My manager ignores any ideas I might give for improvements and things. So are our people involved? Not bad, but a bit of room for improvement up there. You're scoring at about the 34th percentile by the looks of it. So, as I said here, we need to involve our people more. Give them more influence to impact how the organisation functions to achieve its goals. So employee involvement, customer service focus, employee involvement. Now, start to see, as I talk, the logical interrelationship between these things. So if I'm managing this group and I need to have stuff talked about more ways to do with customer service focus, right? I've got 2 ways of doing that. One, I can figure it out myself. Second, I can ask them. So if I ask them, that would appear to have something to do with employee involvement. So you can knock 2 off for free. In fact, you can knock about half a dozen off for free. Right? Never ever underestimate the value of asking a person in an organisation. That's where consultants, that's how I got into this kind of business in 1978, having started in consulting in 1974, because I was an expert consultant. I would come into Moreland, I'd lurk around the place, I'd watch, I'd interview a few people, I'd write some reports, and the chief executive would put it in the bottom drawer. And the whole OD approach is that the people who know best about how to do it are actually doing it. They just haven't been asked the right questions. You know, I'll give you a story because people tend to remember stories. This is way back in my career, working in Wisconsin in a very large agricultural chemical fertiliser kind of works. And late 70s, petrol crisis, operating profits doing this. And so this company was looking at a rationalisation process And they were very much advanced, the Rycoal Chemicals they were called, very much advanced for their day in OD terms. So they were running workshops all around the company around how to save money, basically, cut a long story short. And there's one story, one example that's full of very technical phrase in the consulting industry, the wow shit factor. And it's basically because people keep walking around saying, why didn't the hell we think of that, you know? One group came up with an idea that saved $4.5 million, well, it would save $4.5 million in the first 12 months. It's a very big company. And for want of an analogy, imagine a machine this big as this room, and basically stuff comes in one end and comes out the other end as a product, and there's all sorts of cryogenic things happening and all sorts of other stuff happening between here and there. And really, truthfully, the idea that this group came up with involved nothing more than altering some of the settings on the valves on this machine. Cost zero. Gain 4.5 million in the first 12 months. That's the wow factor, right? Everybody says, what do you think? So I was asked to go and talk to them. I'll never forget, because the guy had the same name as my father. He was called Harry. And so there's me, I was 1981 it would have been, so just under 30, saying to this guy who was my age now, saying, you know, gosh, this is a great idea. And he said, yeah. I said, how did you think of it? And he just looked at me and he said, well, it's obvious if you think about it. Well, that's a really good put down to an enthusiastic young consultant. So I had a thought, and I said, how long have you known about this idea? And he said, oh, probably about 5 or 6 years. And I said, why in God's name didn't you ever tell anybody? And he just looked at me squarely in the eye and said, nobody ever asked me. He said, it's not my job to do management's job for them. I'm a blah, blah, right? So we had these little things made that said the cost of not asking Harry was 27 million over 5 years, right? So there's thousands of Harrys out there. Ask them, they'll surprise you. Systems, the HR systems in particular. So there's 3 elements of systems that we measure. So this is the HR system, selection and placement, so the right person is put in the right job, this kind of stuff. Training and development, I get the training I need to do my job, people get trained around here, etc. And what's called respect for members, which is often what people might call diversity or something like that, but it's got more to do with that. I mean, the fundamental, most effective form of diversity is, why worry about diversity? I mean, why would we think whether this should be a male or a female? Why would we be concerned whether this person might have language difficulties, because we can teach them that and all that kind of... So it's called respect for members. So HR systems, and this is HR's area to deal with, could improve a little. I mean, they're not bad. They're at the 50th percentile, slightly above. We could do probably a bit more on the selection and placement stuff. So that's an HR issue, a little bit of improvement in those ones there. And you can help with that, of course, because you probably do interviewing and things. The next aspect of systems is what...
So can you just flip back a question? So we have a very decentralised model here.
What's that, sorry?
We have a decentralised model.
Yeah. Right, so it depends on how your selection and placement system works, but this is essentially about the right person gets the job, people who work effectively get promoted and get rewarded with promotions and things like that. We take great pains to make sure we get the best person for this job, and so if it's a decentralised model, it's around how's that coordinated through central, HR/OD, whoever looks after that. So there needs to be a centralised coordination of it. And surprisingly enough, the research shows that the average manager is absolutely bloody hopeless at interviewing people in recruiting sense. So ask that question. How effectively are the... I mean, we ask the stupidest questions in the world during interviews, and if we were to record ourselves doing it and watching it, you'd probably be embarrassed. If you're a typical manager, and you may not be, of course. But I am, and I think of some of the questions that I've asked in interviews, I think, oh my God, you know, what were you thinking when you do that? So what you're looking for is to develop a way of behavioural questions related to the constructive styles. in order to get construction. I mean, you can't use recruitment or anything like that, but you want to ask questions around goal setting, achievements, struggling with a challenge, overcoming obstacles. Those are all about achievement stuff, around learning and growth opportunities and what did you. So we recruited a consultant a couple of years ago, and I remembered in an interview, I just wasn't getting to her. And so I really put a hell of a lot of pressure on, because I wanted to find out what was the fundamental learning experience in her life. And it wasn't until she said that her mother died when she was about 10 years of age, and the impact that that had on her, I said, now I've got you. Now I can actually see you. And we hired her because she gave really good illustrations of that. So central coordination, dispersed system, make sure there's good training for people and you've got good stock behavioural type questions for them to ask. Appraisal and reinforcement, 2 out of the 3 are under the average, so food for thought there. Fairness of appraisals. Fairness is sort of like it's too soft a word, but there isn't a better word, unfortunately, in the literature for that one. But it's I get appraised for things that I can actually control, the so-called direct line of sight between effort and outcome. Right, so it's really important you have that. I should only be held accountable for things that I can improve, influence, change myself. Okay. How are we going for time, Shaun? I'll tell you another story. Unfortunately, I've got 45 years of them. But this is a supermarket chain. And this was in the days before the current technology that helps management and supervision change a lot in theory. But this company had brought in one of the very big name, famous global consulting firms and spent millions of dollars on them in developing a performance measurement, performance management system, etc. And putting huge at-risk components into salary packages for store managers and deputy store managers and these kinds of things. This was not in Australia, by the way. And it wasn't working. And the fundamental target was to improve profitability of the business in total, because supermarkets operate on a very small margin. It's very difficult to make profit in supermarkets, as people like Coles and Woolworths have found out the hard way. So the story goes something like this. They asked us to come in, and so we had to have a large team of consultants, which is how I got involved, to try and figure out what could and should happen. And I'll put it in dialogue terms because I'm talking to a store manager. Right? So I asked the store manager the question, what is your goal in this exercise? And he or she will look at me and say, to increase store profitability. And I keep asking questions because I know that's not their goal. Their goal is to get a big bonus because 50% of my pay is at risk, right? I care about the profitability because I care about my pay. Logical. So we finally get this person to admit that yes, my goal is to maximise my bonus, right? And so now I say to them, look, I'm going to run an equation past you. Your goal is to increase your bonus. To increase your bonus, you increase profitability of the store, right? Yep. Not that dumb after all. So how do you increase profitability? And they will say, well, it's things like high volume, low margin throughput, so we increase sales. Okay, bear with me. To increase your bonus, you're going to increase profitability. To increase profit, you increase sales, correct? Yep, got it. Okay, how do you increase sales? And this person will say, well, you have those full page spreads in the newspaper. And you look after that? No, that's actually done by regional marketing. Okay. Bear with this equation. Increase your bonus, you increase your profit, you increase your sales. To increase your sales, you do that advertising. You don't look after that? Nope. Okay. How else do you increase sales? Well, you have lost leaders. Colgate toothpaste at 75 cents a tube or whatever. And you look after that? Oh, no, that's a national supplier agreement. So here we go again. Increase your bonus, you increase profit, increase sales, lost leaders, and you don't look after that stuff? No. And I just keep doing this until they're exhausted. Then I say, fine, but we just discovered you don't control a hell of a lot of things, because you don't in retail, it's a centralised business model. So what do you control? Oh, staff turnover. All right, so let's have a look at your staff turnover and what the costs are associated with that. Shrink rate, which is a euphemism for product that walks out the door unrecorded and unpaid for. which at that stage was 20%. So walk through a supermarket and visualise 20% of that product disappeared. 86% of that will be stolen, and 68% of that 86% will be stolen by your staff. Right? So if you can reduce shrink rate, it increases profit, and so on and so forth. Floor utilisation rates, utility energy costs, etc., etc. So after like 3 days of talking like this with managers, we went back to the company and said, stop measuring them on profitability. Measure them on shrinkage rate, staff turnover rate, all these other things. Oh, we do that. Yeah, I know you do, but you only ever talk to them about profit. And they can't control that. So if you talk to them about these things, which will increase profit, which will contribute to your goal, happy days. $52 million more profit in the first 9 months as a consequence of changing the performance management. Easy number to remember because it's weeks of the year. Huh? So it's pretty basic. It's not rocket science. So we need to do something about our appraisal system here. Somehow people are saying the appraisal system is not entirely fair. It's not direct line of sight. It's not stuff that I can be personally influence. It might be a little bit too subjective, which is hard. Don't try, and message to ODHR people, don't try and convince people that the performance of our appraisal system is entirely objective, because it's not. It can't be. It's objectively subjective, or subjectively objective, whichever way you like to look at it. Right? Use of rewards. So this is the praise and reinforcement. Your supervisor will notice you're doing a good job, could do with some more work, although it is one of the ones that I said earlier that has changed. Use of punishment is a negative thing, but it's being compared to a whole bunch of positive things, so it's been reversed in this graph. So that's above the 50th percentile, and so that's actually a good outcome. That's not too much use of punishment. It's the only negative one in there that we need to deal with. So we don't emphasise punishment to get results, it would appear. A little bit, but not a lot. But we do need to do something about this. And that comes down to everyday supervisors noticing good work and giving people praise. Somehow most of us find it very difficult to look somebody in the eye and give them praise. It's sort of embarrassing. It's a bit touchy-feely, right? But it works, and it's free. It costs you nothing. The last part of systems is the goal-setting system. So there's 4 aspects for goals to be effective. 1, I need to know what the hell it is, goal clarity. Secondly, it needs to be fairly challenging, not too easy, not too hard. I need to be involved in the process, and I need to accept the outcome, the goals. So 3 out of 4 made it above the line, this one did not. And interestingly, when you look at the detail underlying that, it's the goals are not challenging enough is the issue. Right? So people are saying, and now don't go and haul goals that are too hard on people now, but there's a high proportion of the organisation saying goals are too easy. So I'm not challenged. Right? Remember, fairly challenging. And fairly doesn't mean slightly challenging, it means they're challenging but fair. So keep that in mind. So that's the next bit to deal with. The next is what we call the technology. So technology is a phrase in organisation speak for how the organisation takes inputs and turns them into outputs. Information technology being but one example, but they of course snatch the word, and whenever somebody says technology you think these things. Actually that's just one aspect of technology. So the bit of technology that we focus on is job design. Those 5 elements of autonomy, variety, feedback, task identity and significance, and we've added in interdependence as a 6th one. So I get to make some choices about how I do my job. I get to do different things in my job. I can tell how well I'm doing simply by doing my job. Now this is important. That feedback is not feedback from my supervisor. That feedback is feedback from the job. So I'm constantly looking at you to see if you're awake. And if you're awake, I must be doing something all right. Right? I hope. Task identity, I get to do a whole task, not just I do this and I have no idea what the hell this does, but it goes across to that table and they add something to it, and etc., etc. So I get to make a whole one of these. Task identity. So that's pretty good. It's good. It's above the line. 70th percentile. 60th percentile, sorry. Significance. This relates back to customer service focus. I don't think my job is that important. It doesn't really have significant impact on the lives of others, which should come as a surprise because you'd expect people in local government to think that they do, because you do. So therefore somehow we're not reinforcing that and having people see that. And interdependence is, it's actually only one item, and it's like my job is a one-person band. So basically I work in isolation and don't need to interact with anybody, and that's been scored at the relatively high level for lack of interdependence, if you can do my double negative. And so interdependency is an issue in this organisation. You run the risk from an innovation point of view of the left hand not necessarily knowing what the right hand's doing. Skills qualities broken into two categories: communication and leadership. So the first one is upwards, downwards communication for learning. Downwards, upwards, wrong way around. So downward communication is a smidgen below the line, upward communication is just a notch, and communication for learning is over the line. So downward communication is communication down through the organisation, clear, timely, easily understood, put in a way that is relevant to them. Kind of say, yeah, it could be better. It's not bad, it could be better. Upward communication. Does the boss get to hear what we say, or does it get filtered along the way? Right? And so that one's a smidgen under and could do with a bit of work. And communication for learning, is the communication more than just facts and figures and numbers? Is it about people learning about how the organisation functions? And is it information that causes us to inquire and to form conclusions? So it's not just facts and figures, it's information. And last and not least is the leadership stuff, where you folks come in, and 6 aspects of leadership that we measure. One is interaction facilitation. So that's my manager helps me interact with the people that I need to interact with to get my job done. So notice an obvious link. My job's a bit of a one-person show. We're not managing interdependencies very well. And my manager could do a bit more of helping me interact with the people that I need to interact with to get my job done. Task facilitation. Now, my manager helps me solve problems in my job. Do it with a bit of work. Goal emphasis. My manager role models the kind of behaviours and work that we're trying to design and reinforce. So that's down a bit. Consideration. My manager shows consideration to me as a human being, as a person. They are considerate towards me, little down. I do what my manager asks me to do because I admire that person and I want to do it for them to help them succeed. That one scored just above the line. This is the second negative. It's called organisational bases of power. It says, I do things that my manager wants me to do because he or she could get me fired if I didn't. Will impact my bonus or pay or something like that. So it's organisational bases of power. It's the old-fashioned one of I'm the boss, you're the Herc, guess who gets to have the decisions around here. Right? And so that's reversed as well. So that means there is not too much organisational bases of power. These negatives are a bit tricky, but there's 2 of them on a graph with 29 positives. You've got to reverse the negative to be able to compare it to the positives. So here we go. Here is the summary by way of recommendations of what you should be focusing on. More customer service focus. And everything that means. It's not better customer service. It's what do you do, who does it impact, how does it impact it, and let's be clear around what you're doing there. So I'll give you an illustration again, a very brief story. Pennsylvania Paint Group, which in Australia is actually based here in Melbourne, supply about 80% of the world's automotive paint. So they must be doing something right. They're a pretty good organisation, PPG. And they have a very simple, for every individual goal, KPI, whatever word you want to use, exercise. It's a square with an X in the middle. So you've now got 4 triangles. And the top one is the organisation's goal is, your division's goal is, your team's goal is, your goal is. So there's what we're trying to achieve as an organisation. There's therefore what your division is doing, therefore this is what your team is doing, therefore this is what you're doing. Number 1, number 2, number 3, whatever. It's all on one page. And it's just for them, a very visual way of linking. My goal to do this is because the company's goal is to do that, kind of thing, right? So the customer, who am I doing? What am I doing it for? Who am I doing it for? How do they impact me? How do I impact them? Etc. The second is involvement and influence. So the total influence is a little low, but that's, you know, not untypical of local government, because councillors do have an inordinate amount of influence on the organisation. But you sure as hell could do something about employee involvement. So we need to look for more opportunities. So, for instance, when we get to the job design stuff here, if I make a decision as a manager that I could perhaps improve the levels of autonomy in my people's jobs, then why don't I just ask them how that could happen? Because they'll tell me. Has to be boundaries. No, you cannot make capital expenditure decisions. I'm sorry, you're a Parks and Recs person, right? And they won't do that. They won't go there anyway. But if they do, just create the boundaries. So more involvement. The performance review process and the use of rewards could do with more. I left out the goal setting stuff because there's only one element, and I think that will be covered by several of the others. And so this is the money ball. This is the big one. Because when you look at that culture profile, you've actually got humanistic above the 50th percentile. So this is the people side of the circumplex, this is the task side of the circumplex. Right? And so we know that there's a direct relationship between job design and level of achievement in the behavioural norm set in an organisation. It's very hard to feel that I'm expected to set goals, strive, set fairly challenging goals, think ahead and plan, use cause and effect thinking, use analytical thinking, when basically my job is very prescribed. I clock in at 8:30, I do these things, I clock out at 5 o'clock and then go home and do something exciting. So I think that's your money ball, I really do. If you can do something about that area alone, and I would recommend you use an employee process to do it, and there is a direct link between customer service focus and significance, right? So one way of increasing the significance of my job is to having me understand clearly how it impacts on whoever the customer happens to be. And you don't feel obliged to use the word customer, it's just a generic term. If there's something that suits you better, in fact, in your survey, in previous surveys, the customer service focus questions could be arguably not entirely relevant for local government. This year we changed them. We have a new set designed specifically, and we've been in considerable research, because we need them to have the same score as the other ones, otherwise it disturbs everything. And so we've found a set of questions that are not about increasing sales or customers and all that kind of stuff. It talks about end users and people who are impacted by the work that I do and these kinds of things. So we use the new set of questions for customer service focus in your survey, and they seem to be working very well. I'm involved at the back end from the statistical point of view. It could improve communication, and you can never over communicate, unfortunately. You can never communicate enough. And one of the problems, I have to say, is when you have a defensive, and you don't have a defensive, you used to have, but when you have a defensive culture, if there is a lack of communication, the assumptions are that it's bad. Because people make assumptions about the organisations based on the culture. So the more we can have a constructive culture, if we haven't had this month's report, it's because somebody's too busy rather than, oh my God, what are they not telling us, kind of stuff. And note the job insecurity that I showed earlier in the outcomes graph. And more facilitative leadership, for want of a phrase. So there really is an important component that you folks can add by being, in sort of management jargon, more of a coach than a controller, more facilitative than managing, and so looking to get as constructive feedback as you possibly can, because that's just the feedback tool, the LSI, that's all it does is ask people to say what do they see. So you're striving to get as much of that blue in your own LSI 1 and LSI 2 profile as possible. And it's a difficult step, because typically in your type of organisation you have a lot to do. Right? You have a hell of a lot to do. So it's difficult to find the space. It's all too easy when somebody says, look, I walks into your office or your desk space and says, I need some help on this, and you've got stuff you've got to get out the door by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so you say, come back and see me later, or whatever example you might like. It's just you're actually supposed to spend most of your time on dealing with your people. And that's on top of the 24/7 job that you've already got, doing all the things that you have to do. But they have that expectation of you. They never underestimate, and this is where they've scored you down a bit, never underestimate the very high expectations your children have of you as parents. Never ever underestimate the high expectations your staff have of you as a manager. Never ever underestimate the high expectations the audience has of the people on the stage floor. Imagine if you paid $300 to go and listen to a famous singer or something, and he or she walks out and says, I've got a head cold, I feel like shit, and I'm not singing tonight. Right? You're not very forgiving, are you? But you know, the fact remains, this person probably feels like they're on death's door, right? But the expectations are there. So we are performers on a stage as managers. People are looking at us and expecting us to be, if you like, somewhat perfect. Here's the question for you to work out at your table now for the next 20 minutes. What can you do as managers and as a wider leadership team, so don't just think of me personally, do to help build a more constructive culture over the next year? And I'll go back to those causal factors. So there they are there. Where do you think you can focus your efforts where they can make the greatest difference? So what do you think you can do?